Delinquents attack a lady, but her dog does something that shocks everyone. Mrs. Cynthia lived in a small red brick house at the end of a quiet street on the outskirts of the city. She was a lady with silver hair and kind eyes, always with a ready smile for everyone who crossed her path. Known and adored by her neighbors, Mrs. Cynthia was a central figure in the community, always willing to help with advice or a cup of hot tea. Her constant companion was Rex, a German shepherd with a shiny coat and attentive gaze. Rex was not just a guard dog, he was family to Mrs. Cynthia. At every step she took, Rex was by her side, both watchful and a friend, always alert for any sign of danger. The two had a special bond built on a history that few knew. Rex had been adopted by Mrs. Cynthia a few years ago, found in an animal shelter. Since then, Rex had shown unwavering loyalty, protecting his owner. Mrs. Cynthia's routine was simple. During walk, Rex always stayed vigilant, sniffing the air and observing the surroundings, ready to intervene if there was any threat. On that day, Mrs. Cynthia had gone out to shop at the local market, taking Rex with her. As they walked back home, she didn't notice that she was being watched. Two men, known in the neighborhood as the Incredible Bandits due to the audacity of their crimes, were eyeing her. Planning a quick robbery, they followed Mrs. Cynthia to her house. Upon arriving home, Rex, as always, was by her side, but something was bothering him. He sniffed the air, his ears moving nervously. Suddenly, a muffled sound outside caught his attention. He growled softly, going to the front door and positioning himself protectively. Mrs. Cynthia, noticing Rex's uneasiness, went to the window to check. Before she could process what was happening, the door was violently kicked in, and two masked men entered the house, pushing her to the ground. The shock was so great that she barely had time to scream. The bandits started searching the house. They laughed and exchanged taunts while Mrs. Cynthia, fallen on the floor, tried to gather herself. But Rex was not willing to let this happen. One of the bandits, surprised by the dog's reaction, tried to kick him, but Rex dodged and bit the assailant's arm hard. The other bandit, seeing the situation, pulled a knife from his pocket and advanced towards Rex. Mrs. Cynthia, still on the ground, watched the scene with a racing heart. She knew Rex would fight to the end to protect her, but fear for her faithful companion consumed her. Rex's bark echoed through the small house as he lunged at the second intruder. The knife-wielding man slashed wildly, but Rex was too quick. He darted to the side, avoiding the blade and clamping his jaws onto the man's leg. The man screamed, stumbling back and dropping the knife. Mrs. Cynthia, still on the floor, managed to pull herself up enough to lean against the wall. Her heart pounded with fear and desperation. "Rex, be careful," she shouted, her voice trembling. But Rex was beyond hearing. He was in full protector mode, determined to drive these intruders away. The first man, nursing his bitten arm, grabbed a vase from a nearby table and hurled it at Rex. The heavy object missed by inches, shattering against the wall. Rex released his grip on the second man's leg and growled menacingly, his fur bristling. He positioned himself between Mrs. Cynthia and the two men, ready for whatever came next. The men, now clearly panicked, exchanged a quick glance. "We need to get out of here," one of them muttered. But before they could make a move, Rex charged again, snapping at their heels. The men bolted for the door, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape. With the intruders gone, Rex returned to Mrs. Cynthia, who had finally managed to stand. She wrapped her arms around his neck, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Rex. You saved me," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. As the adrenaline began to wear off, Mrs. Cynthia sank into her favorite armchair. Rex at her feet. As she stroked Rex's head, memories flooded back to her. Memories of how Rex had come into her life and all the times he had protected her. Years ago, after her husband passed away, Mrs. Cynthia felt an emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. Her daughter, concerned for her well-being, suggested she adopt a dog for companionship. Reluctantly, Mrs. Cynthia agreed and visited the local animal shelter. That's where she first saw Rex. Rex was different from the other dogs. He was quiet, reserved, and his eyes held a depth of sadness that spoke to her. The shelter worker told her that Rex had been found wandering the streets, malnourished and scared. There was something about him that tugged at her heartstrings, and she knew she had to take him home. From the day Rex entered her home, things began to change. His presence brought comfort and a sense of security. He would follow her everywhere, always vigilant, always ready to protect. A few months after adopting Rex, Mrs. Cynthia had fallen in the garden, unable to get up. She called out, and within moments, Rex was by her side, barking furiously until a neighbor heard and came to help. It was then she realized just how much Rex understood and cared for her. Now, as she looked into his loyal eyes, she knew without a doubt that adopting Rex was one of the best decisions she had ever made. He wasn't just a pet, he was her guardian, her friend, and her hero. And today, once again, he had proven his unwavering loyalty and bravery. The night was unusually quiet as Mrs. Cynthia and Rex sat together, trying to find some semblance of calm after the harrowing events of the day. She had just started to drift off to sleep when a noise outside jolted her awake. Rex, ever vigilant, was already on his feet, ears perked and alert. Through the thin curtains, Mrs. Cynthia saw the shadows of the two men creeping around the side of the house. Her heart raced as she realized they had returned. This time they were determined to finish what they had started. "Rex, we need to be ready," she whispered, her voice trembling but determined. Rex responded with a low growl, his muscles tense and ready for action. This time, Mrs. Cynthia grabbed the phone and quickly dialed the police, explaining the situation in hushed tones. "Please hurry," she urged before hanging up and turning her attention back to Rex. "Where is that damn dog?" One of them snarled, clutching a metal pipe. Rex launched himself at the intruders with a ferocity that took them by surprise. He went straight for the man with the pipe. The man screamed, dropping the pipe and trying to shake Rex off. The second man, panicked and desperate, before he could react, Rex released his grip and charged at him, knocking him to the ground. Just as it seemed Rex had the upper hand, the sound of sirens filled the air. The men, realizing they were out of time, scrambled to their feet and bolted out the door, Rex hot on their heels until they disappeared into the darkness. Moments later, the police arrived. Officers rushed in, guns drawn. But the immediate danger had passed. Rex stood at the doorway, panting heavily but unharmed, his eyes still fixed on the path the intruders had taken. Mrs. Cynthia sank into a chair, relief flooding through her as she recounted the events to the officers. They assured her they would do everything in their power to catch the men and ensure her safety. As the police secured the house and took statements, neighbors began to gather outside, drawn by the commotion. Word of Rex's bravery spread quickly, and soon the small crowd was buzzing with admiration for the loyal dog. One of the officers, after inspecting the scene, approached Mrs. Cynthia. "Ma'am, your dog is incredible. He protected you bravely. We'll make sure you're safe. But you have one remarkable guardian here." Mrs. Cynthia looked down at Rex, who was now sitting calmly at her feet, and smiled through her tears. "Yes, I know. He's my hero," she said softly, reaching down to stroke his head. In the days that followed, Mrs. Cynthia's house became a symbol of bravery in the neighborhood. Friends and neighbors visited frequently, bringing food and offering help with repairs.